Hi, Marek. Thanks for being on Love and Philosophy.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks a million for inviting me on.
It's good to see you again. I met you in Austria. Was it a year ago? Not quite a year ago.
It's a good few months ago. End of July, beginning of August.
Yeah, and I realized we had a lot of things in common, and then I was asking you about some of your work, and you had a new book coming out, which is now out, and it's really exciting. I love it when these kind of things happen, that I just stumble across a book that I've been looking for, because I'm constantly thinking about research methods and stuff in cognitive neuroscience, and so I'm really excited to find your book, which is called The Great Delusion. Do you want to introduce the book a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, no, this is a work that I've been doing with my colleague Craig Speelman in Edith Cowan University in Perth in Australia. We've been working together for some time, and it kind of brings together a number of different strands around theory and practice in psychological research in particular. So we sort of picked up on together, our sort of first publication together was sort of back in 2013 or so, when we looked at the use of averages and the mean in psychological research and the kind of limitations to that, the kinds of assumptions that underlie it and so on. Nothing terribly new to most psychologists, and yet despite it not being terribly new, everyone still sort of continues on as though everything's fine when we think it really isn't. And so our work has kind of progressed and developed around a number of different areas since, but all within that kind of general field of scientific practice and psychology. So this book is really an attempt to bring a number of those threads together, both in terms of the kinds of theories that underlie psychological research, often implicit, the assumptions about both human beings and about how psychological research can work, and also then the implications for how we understand and interpret, and also crucially apply the findings of psychological research, and trying to kind of elucidate some of the underlying issues in a kind of fairly stark, clear, and sometimes polemical way. We kind of note in the book that the kinds of issues that we raise, almost none of them is new. They have decades of history behind them, but for whatever reason, they've never been adequately addressed. And in the current fervor for methodological reform and scientific reform within psychology, it's worth kind of trying to articulate these again and just add our voice to the chorus to a certain extent.
Wonderful. And it's the Great Psychology Delusion. I left that word out. But I also can't see you at all. I don't know where you went. I'm sorry to say.
That's my...
I can always, if you want to just put your picture on, or, oh, now I see you again.
Yeah. Yeah, so it looks like I'll have to turn my video on and off again every once in a while. I don't know why.
Yeah, I don't know why that happens, but we'll just talk. And if it doesn't turn out that it records your face the whole time, you can send me a picture of you or something, or something from the book, and I can sort of put it up so that there's something visual for people to look at. But I don't want to waste our time, because as long as I can hear your audio, I can work with it. But this word delusion, I think, is really strong. And it's funny because as I read the book, it starts out, I don't know if you chose that title to be hyperbolic or to exaggerate for effect, or I would like to know why you chose that word and talk about that word a bit, because it feels like a really, really important word in this moment in so many ways, across so many levels of life, but especially in academic work and psychology and things like this. But as I was reading the book, I wonder what you think about this. I started to think about this contradiction, this delusion, and the contradiction that's kind of in that word, almost in a positive sense, like as if we could notice what's going on, and that itself could be this way into the pluralistic place and even optimistic place that we get by the end. I just want to put that out there, but I want to know about this word and how that word came and what you think about that word, delusion.
Yeah, so it is perhaps a little bit hyperbolic and a little bit polemical for sure, but I think it articulates something that we both find particularly frustrating in the sort of dialogue and discussion around these issues within the profession. So, we open with that Oxford dictionary definition: an idiosyncratic belief or impression maintained despite being contradicted by reality or rational argument. And for so many of the points that we address in the book, As I said, they've got decades of history behind them. The kind of problematic use of averages or the mean in psychological research, the sort of very weak and undisciplined way in which the concept of theory and theoretical work is done within psychology. We've had decades of criticisms raising and articulating these points, and psychologists and mainstream psychological research just plows on as though all was well, or we can just sort of dig ourselves out from this hole by just digging faster and digging deeper, or in the current sort of vigor of methodological reform, if we just do our stats harder, then the underlying in principle problems with those statistics will be sort of massaged away just by our discipline and our good intent. So we really want to call that out, and to flag that these are not issues that require some of them. I think we do provide some new articulations for some of the underlying confusions, but the psychological research and the institution or the community of psychological researchers, which is disparate and varied, but a huge chunk of them just seem to sort of blindly follow through on this is how things are done without really having a clear enough idea about why things are done that way and what is the product of the practices that we have. And so if we can understand those practices a bit more clearly and just address what it is we're interested in knowing a little bit more explicitly, we can hope to possibly start to break this delusion. But really, we have to see and sort of name it as such, to sort of say, look, there's an awful lot of things that we think we know that we don't know. Those are things that we think are psychological facts or are the findings of psychological research. But we can only claim that if we think of psychology in one very specific way and not another way, which is, again, very often, in fact, psychologists think in two different ways about their discipline without realizing they're switching between them. And that lack of self-insight is what leads to delusions, and delusions then lead to problems. So we're trying to sort of use that rather blunt instrument of the notion of a delusion to sort of crack open the shell of this kind of mainstream conceptions and misconceptions of psychological science.
Yeah, that's kind of what I meant by what I felt by the end. I mean, we're always talking about dichotomy, beyond dichotomy, and paradox and things like this. And there's a kind of a way in which you're trying to make us realize how general and disparate and diverse all of this is so that we can be more specific. Does that make sense to you?
That's a sort of nice, succinctly put, and a nice, succinct way of putting it. Yeah, absolutely.
And also, it's so interesting because you go into the historical and how all of this came together, and that actually psychology is probably one of the most popular things that people read about or study or even want to be, part of. It's something we all think of at some point in our life, and how we come to it is probably different. And yet, you're basically fundamentally showing that, or you're showing that the fundamental kind of ways that we do psychology in an academic sense are deeply flawed. That's also really how do you see that strange contradiction? Is it because it's so important to us that we want to believe we're making progress with it? Do you see it as connected in that way, that it is so important to so many of us that we would be delusional about it?
So I think there's a number of forces in play, and crucially, one of the things that underpins the whole book. And so we draw on work in the history and philosophy of science to a significant extent at various aspects of the work. And, going back to science psychology studies and sociology of science, we've had sort of 40 odd years of work there, which make it clear, very, very clear, that psychology, or not psychology, that science more generally, in fact, is very much a human endeavor and brings with it the characteristics of other human endeavors. and the messiness of attempts to coordinate our actions and to fit our behaviors in according to sort of standardized practice within a given community and so on. And once you start applying this this lens to psychology as a discipline, you can go back to its explicit foundation as a professional body in the case of the APA, or sort of tracking the development of it as a set of courses through universities and also through applied settings. And essentially you can, it's sort of very easy to sort of identify and sort of show how these threads, many of them are quite separate and are never properly drawn together. And where they are drawn together, it's often for political or pragmatic ends rather than because of a coherence of scientific worldview. And there's a sort of a contemporary analysis from the late 80s onwards, certainly from the 90s through to the present, of psychology as a scientific discipline, as largely being defined not by the set of phenomena in which we're interested, but rather by the set of methods which we use. And that, again, is a characteristic not of a scientific practice per se, but of a community of professionals. So if you want to become a psychologist, in theory, well, the narrative is, well, I'm interested in people, I'm interested in understanding the mind, I want to understand how behavior works, I'm interested in experience. We say all these kinds of things, but then to become a psychologist is to learn to use certain research methods. And the phenomena almost get pushed to one side. And insofar as we are all certainly interested in people, we're interested in the phenomena. But if we want to be a psychologist, if we want to sort of show our bona fides and our scientific credentials, then we roll up our sleeves and we take whatever phenomena it is we're interested in, and we find out how to apply an ANMILSA to it. Or maybe these days we might do structural equation modeling or whatever the sort of current fad is. And these days we might do registered reports and all kinds of wonderful things to show how good a scientist we are. But the discipline is, unlike a great number of other sciences, really defined by the set of methods in the toolbox more than the phenomena. And so we have a tendency to sort of strong arm our phenomena into certain ways of asking questions, rather than adapting the research methods to suit the phenomena. Because again, scientific psychology, again, the narrative around its history is that it was founded as a laboratory discipline. The origins of science, or the traditional story, is the two Willies, as I think of them, William James in Harvard and Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig. And they, psychology's founding happened in around about 1876 by setting up of laboratories. Now, again, every other science starts with naturalism, and kind of naturalistic gathering of phenomena, doing decades of astronomical observations, or just throwing things and seeing how far they land, or and just sort of writing down what's in the world, going out and collecting butterflies. Psychology didn't really go through that phase. And as a result, our phenomena are very much defined by that which can be produced in a laboratory, rather than that which kind of tends to happen naturally in various contexts. And the being a psychologist is therefore learning how to use certain kinds of methods, at least for experimental psychology. There's a parallel development of individual differences and the kind of trait-based or personality and sort of intelligence testing and so on, which all of that kind of kicked off before 1876, and didn't get integrated into psychology as a sort of set of professions until, again, at the earliest, we're talking about the 1890s, and then kind of developed further through the early 1900s. So they're sort of somewhat parallel historical tracts until it became politically or economically necessary to combine the two, so as that they'd have a big enough and powerful enough voice within academic work and within universities. And it's sort of recognizing that all of that sociological context in the development, practice, and identity of our science is a crucial thing that we maybe just need to be a little bit more clear about, and that historical view offers, I think.
Yes. It's there's so much in there. This is going to be messy, but I think it's so important because it's the same pattern I see so much where what we care about the most, we try to get really rigorous about, but we end up going to what you're talking about, more quantitative, the methods, which is understandable and wonderful because it's great, but then we lose track. Or, I mean, science has respect in a way because of these methods that you have to learn. You know, when people don't understand all of these very difficult ways of quantifying and that are scientific and that really take a lot of work to understand, and you know, you have to study them and you're able to do them. And then because you have this kind of specialization, it can seem like that's whatever you find with those methods, it must be right because it's so hard to use the methods and the methods are so hard to understand. Do you see any relation between the way that science ends up having to kind of defend its methods so as to remain scientific in a sense, and this way that what actually we really care about and the reason we're doing it gets we get delusional about it? So there's this weird loop that's happening that's, I think, needs something like to be called delusion just to wake us up, to get us to look at it again. Is any of this making any sense at all?
Yeah, and that's the kind of logic that we're looking at. And look, we don't have we're sort of fairly realistic in the extent to which it might wake some people up, it might not. But and there are other aspects to the literature out there. There are other ways of coming at this, but the reality is that very much that we construct our phenomena. And we have, as a discipline, in a way that is unusual for scientists, decided that there are certain valid ways of constructing phenomena, and only those will be let in and given, recognized as being valid or acceptable topics for discussion. To a large extent, kind of relegating what we refer to as the real world to just the kind of messy outside of psychological science domain, or the domain of scientific practitioners. Good luck to them, rather than kind of hardcore scientific work. And given that we construct our phenomena in order, logically, and I think the general idea might be that, when physicists bring things into the lab, it's so they can stabilize, simplify the environment, control it, and thereby stabilize otherwise a phenomenon that's otherwise too dynamic or messy to be adequately sort of observed and understood in the real world, for want of a better phrase. The same kind of logic applies in psychology, except that we didn't bring something in from the real world. We created it from observations there was nothing systematic about our observations of the real world, which are then kind of saying, well, let's stabilize this in the lab. The work really comes from just largely actually from philosophical tradition. So particularly in cognitive psychology, which is the area I'd most work within, our notions of reasoning, decision-making, problem-solving, all of these are drawn from philosophical analyses of these things and how to go about them in a normative manner, rather than, well, let's go out and just watch people, what they do day in, day out, and we'll see what kinds of behaviors show up and whether or not it's worth using those traditional categories, or whether or not we should be looking for other kinds of ways of sort of breaking the phenomena down and analyzing them in a way that's sensitive to contextual diversity in the real world.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's just taking us a while to really come to grips with that.
Come to grips with it. Also, the methods are developing in a different way, and I think well, it seems like a lot of the things that you discuss in the book could be placed into kind of dualistic or either or categories. Of course, I'm coming at it that way and looking at it that way, but I mean, maybe we could talk about the aggregation aspect, the delusion. You mentioned the mean before, in the sense that we've kind of set up an experimental way or habit, even that is kind of one thing looking at another thing, and applying methods to it. And part of what I'm trying to push towards is like, how do we do that, like break that into a constellation or more multiplicity way, which you talk about as fractal and all kind of, you get to that too in the plurality. But I think it's so habitual the way that we just even do the procedures, stimulus response and so on, that it can be really hard to even notice it. So maybe we could talk about this like individual group. I think that's a way to think about the way we confuse scales in the aggregate delusion. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so this really was kind of the foundational issue that, again, myself and Craig's work sort of began with this issue. And it is simply the underlying assumption that human beings are sufficiently interchangeable that when you want to study the mind, as though everyone just has the same one, that you can gather a large number of people, and typically we see it the larger the better, and um, produce data according to some protocol or other, and then sort of tabulate that data such that you average across all of the data available to you, and that kind of boils off the noise, as it were. You get kind of a balancing of confounds where you can control for them, and you kind of you average out the noise so as that you're looking at some kind of true measurement, or ever approximating sort of closer to a true measurement of whatever it is, the psychological variable you're interested in. But to do so, you have to make that assumption that human beings are interchangeable, that we're all essentially doing the same thing when we go about performing a given, let's say, cognitive or behavioral task, and that it's sort of safe to assume. So this is what's sometimes referred to as the ergodic assumption, that human beings are ergodic. And ergodic basically just is that idea that if you want to understand an individual in a group, you can use the average to do so. But essentially the average of the group is sufficiently similar to the average of the individual, so that if you analyze the behavior of the group, it gives you insight into what the individual does. That's sort of fine for things like hydrogen atoms, or sort of various aspects of chemistry and so on. But human beings are basically the least ergodic things in the known universe. We all individually change over time. We do things differently as individuals. We do things differently from context to context, let alone the different people doing the same thing in different contexts. And so that notion of aggregation, of sort of aggregating scores in order to approximate a truer score, which underlies almost all tests of mean difference, which are fundamental to the vast majority of laboratory psychological work. That really is it's an untenable assumption that goes almost entirely unquestioned. Now, there's a literature on it. As I've said, there's very little in the book that really is kind of novel to myself and Craig's work. We're drawing on the work of Peter Molinar, Alan Hamaker, and a whole host of other people in this. But that idea that you can aggregate across scores for human beings, in sort of is diagnostic of an assumption about what human beings are and how they work that really just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And so it's to sort of misrepresent phenomena at one scale, so the phenomena of sort of the behavior of a sample or a group, and phenomena at another scale, which is the behavior of an individual human being. Psychologists will often just, you ask them what they're interested in. They're interested in understanding the mind, which it tends to occur on a one per person basis. So you're interested in understanding the behavior and experience of all individual human beings, but in fact, in a large amount of the cases of our research, we don't look at individual human beings. We only look at samples and their averages. And not being able to see that mismatch is the delusion, right? So doing one thing, think you're doing something else, and just not having the capacity to reflect and realize that sliding between scales that you're doing is, and then assuming that, at the end of research with samples and averages, I've got insight into individuals and their individual behaviors, is it's a delusional thing. And it's indicative of that sort of conceptual slippage that really is desperately common in way too much of psychological science.
Right, because it's this generality, specificity thing that you bring up often. And is it Molinar? I think you just mentioned there's the ergodic switch and the way that some huge amount of studies, over 80% of papers or something, make these really general claims about the group scale, the people level. And yet they're actually probably being applied at individual levels. So, and as you said, every individual, whatever we mean by mind, this embodied experience of being in the world is going to be a little bit different in very big ways, right? So, but still, you also say somewhere in the book that, a lot, we do get a lot from this too, from this scale of studying at the group behavior. I mean, a lot of progress has been made in a sense. We are understanding things at that scale differently. What would it look like to open that up a bit so that we're getting more specific about what we're actually studying, or maybe we're even able to think about it on individual levels? But let me just ask you this question. I mean, if we're studying everything at this group level, then what is it even really explaining in your, like, how are we actually able to still get somewhere with that if it's not actually being applied at that group level so much?
Yeah, I think there's an awful lot being covered by individual professionals' sensitivity. So particularly when you talk about that sort of question of the application in the realm of psychological practice of different kinds. So if we think about clinical psychology or counseling or educational psychology and elsewhere, you have so we have what's called the research practice gap, which is the extent, depending on who you ask. The research practice gap is different things, actually. So for researchers, the research practice gap is the practitioners not doing what they're supposed to be doing. They should be listening to the researchers and sort of applying the theories in their work. And they should be doing so in a kind of disciplined and careful way that is sort of adequately implements all the details of the theoretical, the research work sort of appropriately. For the clinicians, the research practice gap is the extent to which the research just doesn't fit the needs of the clinician, because the research is conducted with samples. The samples are usually carefully selected and clean in ways that individual cases are almost never. And therefore, there is a mismatch between the kinds of knowledge that is produced by work in research settings to that kind of knowledge that needs to be applied in practitioner settings. And that kind of mismatch, that failure to sort of grasp that there's an underlying shift in scale between a sample or an average or a group to an individual case, that is can't be sort of bridged by a simple set of maybe clever statistics or sort of straightforward sort of practice. That insofar as a practitioner is able to take insights from the domain of research and apply them effectively in their day-to-day practice with individuals, the sensitivity and the individual responsiveness of that clinician to their individual clients is doing a huge amount of the heavy lifting there. So it's not to say that there's no orientation or insight being provided by the research, but rather that the extent to which the research is actually supporting practice with an individual client is because it's being digested and transformed and implemented by the often implicit, although sometimes also explicit, expertise of the practitioner in question. And the various frustrations you get in the communication between these two groups of professionals. So, yeah, and there are those who properly straddle both domains, but they also sort of tend to switch the way they speak when they move between domains. So it was a lovely observation by Sanaka Dahan in her book Enactive Psychiatry, in which she taught, she was a philosopher embedded in a working psychiatric hospital, and would also then go to psychiatric conferences. And she noted so she doesn't talk about it explicitly in terms of code switching, but we might also describe it in those terms, that the psychiatrists tend to switch their ways of speaking in different contexts. So in conferences, they talked about the brain all the time. And again, there's this assumption that we'll find underlying aspects of brain change or neurological function and so on that will explain or provide insight into psychiatric experience. But in the hospital, working directly with clients, they spoke in the language of clients, and the references to the brain, are certainly attenuated, and they discuss things in terms of experience and behavior and the sort of more concrete aspects. And the clinicians are they don't seem to be aware of that code switching. So even where a person, has their feet in both worlds and seems to bridge them, actually their practice would seem to be doing something different. And so if we can just sort of recognize that these movements are happening, we can perhaps reflect on them and orient ourselves more effectively. So the issue is not that one scale is wrong and one scale is right, but that you should know when you're moving between them and know what's changing when you move between them. And in fact, there's almost certainly more than just these two perspectives in play, right? So even, if we think of just in terms of the scale of human behavior and the way in which that we study it, in the domain of sort of group behavior, we look at we have whole disciplines like sociology and anthropology. At the level of the sort of similar behaviors by many people, lots of psychological work with samples is done. But in the case of individual actions taken by a single person, that's at the level of a single human being. But we also then we dig deeper. We want to go further and look at the way in which different kinds of behaviors can be produced by nervous systems and bodies and skeletons and so on. And then deeper into the sort of cellular structure of neural operation. So these are all different scales at which phenomena occur, and they're not entirely independent of one another, but nor do they simply relate to one another in a simple one-to-one reductivist manner. And so when you switch between scales, you must be sensitive to the way in which you're changing your perspective on the phenomena in question. And if you're not sensitive to that change and you treat them like they're all studying the same thing, if I say, well, if I use an MRI machine to study neural activation when a person presses a button on, given a certain task and stimulus, then I'm studying, and then I do that with lots of people, and I average all their results, and I call all of these things decision making. I call what's happening in the brain the decision being made. I call the pressing of the button the decision being made. I call the behavioral task the decision being made, and I call the average of all of these tasks across all the different people the decision being made, because they all use the same stimulus. I bludgeoned a whole bunch of really crucial distinctions in the hope of gaining insight, and really blinded ourselves. Whereas if we can shift between these perspectives and know to just be cautious in the way that we do so, we're going to end up with a much higher grain of resolution of knowledge. And we're also eventually, we don't know yet, but eventually I think we will learn to move between these different scales of discussion more effectively. And I think that kind of thing will start to help us close the research practice gap, and also force us to become much more clear and sharp-edged when we think about our theories and our concepts.
Wonderful. Yeah, I haven't seen you in a while now. If you want to switch your camera off and on, it doesn't really matter. But yeah, that's really what sometimes I talk about holding paradox, and it can sound so easy, but I really think it's like the hardest thing, because opening to multiplicities it's very hard to do that, right? You talk about the mechanical and the clinical and the research and the practice, and we're still talking in these either or things, which we have to, I understand. But it can be so overwhelming if you're in any of these fields, if you're doing research or you're a clinician or you're doing both, especially to hold all this in mind, and to open to the multiplicity of that. There's something very real. There's realism in a way. There's perspectival, ways of understanding this process we're all part of that's real. And therefore, these group scales are giving us something very important. And we also have to take every individual into account. And all of that we've already just discussed is going to be at play in that. So there's all these meta, fractal, multiple, a lot of people just we don't want to hold that. It's really hard. And I wonder if some of it is about trying to just be aware of that, is what I hear you saying. so that we can help each other find ways to develop ways to hold that for each other and help each other notice that, because it is really hard to deal with all of this in the same way that we talked about at the beginning, where the stuff we care about so much, we need to make it scientific, it needs to be academic, we need to get grants, and so we end up kind of putting our time and energy into either details or, more abstract things, depending what kind of, maybe which discipline we choose. But what we're getting to now is where we need all of it and we need to all be able to hold it. So does that make any sense to
It
you
does.
in terms of, yeah, this feedback loop problem that you were talking about?
I think it really does, and I think I think we're seeing, or I think we will see, um, paradigm shifts arising because of it. I think there is that this need for pluralistic view is, there's so many psychologists, I think, even those who I would, include in the criticisms that I've been talking about, would probably kind of feel hard done by. It's like, well, of course, I don't mean this to apply everywhere, and of course, I'm not saying this is sort of general or universal. But again, you mentioned some of the work that myself and Craig did with some of Craig's students, who looked at how psychologists actually write about our results. And we do tend to write I say, you can hear my generalization there, right? So we do tend to write, but in these kind of generalizing ways, that do seem to sort of shift from one scale to another, this kind of make this ergodic switch. And we don't have it as a sort of a consistent ongoing practice to allow for that pluralism. In fact, what we tend to do is balkanize ourselves a little bit and kind of set up an identity and then fixate on it. So, for example, that there's a whole bunch of psychologists who might listen to this and think, well, I don't do that. I'm a qualitative researcher. And it's a delightful notion, a qualitative researcher. What's that? As opposed to what? Again, why are we defining ourselves by our methods rather than saying, well, I'm going to use whatever methods are most appropriate for the phenomenon in which I'm interested? And, the qualitative people might say, well, the qualitative methods just are the phenomena in which I'm interested in. That's my specialism. And it's like, okay, but how often do you talk to the quanti people then? And how often is there a real effort to integrate and draw insight from across them? And of course, there's a whole bunch of mixed methods people here going then, but Marek, we do this all the time. But again, there's the mixed methods people aren't getting invited to the qualitative conferences. None of them are being invited to the quantitative conferences in the same kind of amount. And there's this kind of uncertainty and quite comfort with the idea of that separation. And kind of almost like a methodological apartheid of like, well, these are the people I'm comfortable talking to, and it's okay for me to keep talking to them because there's plenty enough for us to say to each other without making it messier by having to talk to that group. And I think there is, unfortunately, plenty enough for all of these people to talk to each other. And that is going to be satisfying enough for individual careers. But what it means is, at the scale of the profession and community, scientific community of psychology, it's going to prevent insight and theoretical development. And it's going to sort of prevent us from reaching the kinds of understandings that we have. So we've got to break those silos open. We've got to get people away from identities based on methods. And we have to do that as a community, not just as individual researchers. So how do you do that? So it really is just that kind of forcing ourselves to step back and kind of take note. And that's one of the things that myself and Craig are really trying to do in the book, is to try and cover a number of those angles. Because again, all of this material, the sort of certain ways of articulating it about scale and so on, that is perhaps more specific to us, but bringing in issues around the aggregation and the problematic ways in which we conceive of human beings in quantitative research methods, but also the research practice gap and the sort of poor discipline we have around theory and conceptual development. these are interlinked things. These are not separate phenomena. And it's trying to show the ways in which they are interlinked and articulated in a way that demonstrates how important the sociological interventions are going to be, not just the statistical and the methodological ones, are the kinds of things that we're trying to elucidate in the book that maybe aren't done as sort of roundly in other places, where the focus tends to be on one of these aspects at a time, rather than sort of picking them up as a tangled mess that we need to not fully unpick. In fact, as you say, Andrea, like, we need to get used to the idea that, no, we're just going to have to be willing to sort of shift perspective and be a little bit more mobile than we've been.
Yeah, I think we have to hold that tension. It's very hard. It's tense, it's uncomfortable, but we could help each other do it, because we could still specialize in a sense if we were able to develop a way to do that and come together and discuss it as multiplicity rather than either or. My philosophy is better than your philosophy. My method is better than your method, because I feel like a lot of it developed through that kind of competitive nature, and I understand that, and that's not like necessarily a bad thing. But instead of competition, we could talk about care. That we actually do most of us come into these disciplines because we really care about these issues. And then it's really hard. I mean, it's really hard to make your career. It's really hard to get through all the schooling. It's really hard to just be alive, be in relationships with humans in these environments. And I feel like, having talked to a lot of people, and been in a lot of different groups, that a lot of people really come into it from a place of care, and they really want to understand these things, and then they get burned in certain ways, and you find your group that you won't get burned in, or you get really uncomfortable because you don't know something and everyone else knows it, because it's a different, you can't know everything. We can't know everything in every discipline, but you're assumed to, right? Or people like treat you in a certain way because you're not in that group. All of this feels like part of the scales of what you're talking about too. And when you bring up, the multiplicity, the multifracticality, the federation of psychology, ways that we can open to that in our research. Also, doesn't it also happen at these other scales too, just in our lives and in the way we can get back to a motivating force that isn't hurting us or negative?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not just about that we get closed off or burned or turned away, but also we get channelized or canalized, as it's sometimes described in neurological terms, where it's like, well, I've become this type of researcher. I've adopted this certain set of methods, and I can build a career with this. And if I step outside of that, I'm actually weakening my career. But I can achieve lots of success by just keeping doing this one thing. And in fact, it's so difficult to do that I need to spend a lot of time specializing in order to be able to do it. But then there's no bridge for me. There's no way back. All I can do is follow this channel. And but I think it is all motivated by that notion of care. But I think just as you described, most psychologists do get into this because they're interested in often just some aspect of human experience, of something really crucial, very much close to home, and sort of often personal and intimate. And I think there's a way to, if we start paying attention to the practitioners a bit more, and then start including the practitioners in the research discussions with a little bit more agency, I think there's a real opportunity to overcome our fear of pluralism in that way, because that's the kind of thing where you see kind of pluralistic work being done in other disciplines. An example that I have that I draw from Hasuk Chang's work. So I think his Water H2O is where he first produces it, but it's an example. Anyone who knows me is sick of hearing me make this example, because I think it just is brilliant, which is that the GPS system, right? So that's an engineering achievement, but it depends on satellites that have been put in orbit using Newtonian physics. On those satellites are atomic clocks that can only work because of our understanding of quantum mechanics. Those atomic clocks used basically our sort of track time, which is corrected using Einsteinian relativistic mathematics, in order to produce an identification of a coordinate on the globe of the Earth, which is then represented in a flat Earth map to allow for navigation by a human being walking or sort of moving in a street. All of those perspectives are mutually exclusive descriptions of the universe. right? You can't be Einsteinian Newtonian at the same time. You can't be Newtonian and quantum at the same time. You can't be Einstein and quantum at the same time. You can't be flat Earth and round Earth at the same time. But the GPS system works brilliantly. It is all of those things simultaneously. But because it is something that is also embedded in a big collection of human practices, that makes it all make sense and doesn't worry about the ways in which it doesn't mismatch. So that kind of pluralism can be immensely productive. Now, at the same time, a big part of our complaint in the book is that psychology is messy and incoherent in the way that we theorize. But the messiness isn't the problem. It's the way that we conflate the mess with reductionism and try to, eliminate, sort of saying basically that in any given case, this one concept is the same, and should be treated as the same, or is basically the same thing. It's like, no, that kind of plural definitions of concepts is okay, so long as we're clear what we mean and how we relate to other things and where it doesn't relate, so that we don't try what James Flynn calls a conceptual imperialism, where the concept developed at one scale is applied at another scale in an uncritical fashion. And it's that sort of, as you say, sort of being comfortable in the tension of pluralism, I think is a practice that we as a discipline really should start trying to figure out. I think incorporating and working with practitioners of various kinds, and therefore sort of facing and recognizing the experience of individual human beings as a sort of crucial and ineliminable and unaverageable way is a sort of a crucial first step that we can take. And also just kind of building into our own, the way we teach at undergrad and the way we work as professionals, just a sort of these deliberate kind of little kicks to say, well, actually, we have to listen to, I'm going to, go and listen to the qualitative people for a while, or I'm going to go and listen to the social people for a while in my cognitive work, or I'm going to go and listen to the cognitive people for a while elsewhere, and so on. That we sort of build in that kind of silo breaking, a little bit of bridging as just a sort of a standard practice in order to, just as you say, help each other hold that tension and be okay with it. Is it's a strong disciplinary task, but they've done it elsewhere, and there's no reason to believe that we can't pull it off too if we set our minds to it.
Beautiful. I love that. And I'm so glad you brought up that example. I heard you maybe talk about that somewhere, or maybe we talked about it. I don't know. But I really wanted to bring that in because I think it's wonderful. And also, something that's important, you keep mentioning pluralism. We are mentioning pluralism and perspectivalism and these kind of things, but it doesn't mean anything goes too. That's also part of the tension, is realizing all this matters. It's real. It's connected. It's inseparable. It's influencing each other. Like, that's also part of that tension that we haven't learned how to hold so well, because we tend to take this kind of, I'm the scientist and I'm looking at the thing, or we start fighting about, everything is consciousness or everything is matter or whatever. So it's wonderful, the GPS example, because everything, you can't resolve those things together, but you don't need to, because they're just different ways of trying to understand or even helping to create something that is inseparable and shared. And for that very reason, those things can't be reconciled. So I just wanted to bring that up because you do in the book too. And I think it's important that it's not a anything goes kind of idea either, which is maybe why it's so tense, but also why that tension and that care can actually be just as motivating as competition or any of the other things we've used, to motivate us. Is there anything you want to add to that?
I just sort of fully endorse that. I think it is, and then that is this fear for so many scientists. The value of science is that there is a single objective truth to which we can aspire, and that's the thing that prevents us from being, pardon my language, bullshitters. It's like the thing that sets us apart and allows for progress and achievement and so on. And I think that sort of, while that might be a crucial motivating narrative that we'll have to deal with and address in a sensitive manner, it is clearly not true, right? Scientists are very capable of holding multiple truths in mind at the time, and for that to be okay. And the idea that that can only be managed under the prospect of every one of those scientists also believing that ultimately there's a single objective truth that they're all aspiring to, just from different angles, and they just all haven't got there yet. That's it's clearly not the case that that's essential, because we've been doing this for hundreds of years and we've still not got there. And in fact, everyone, every time someone predicts the end of science in the next 50 years, everyone else knows they're going to be wrong. You can be pluralistic and still be doing good science. And you can be disciplined and scientific and not think that there's a single objective truth that you have to be aiming for. But being pluralistic is very, very different from the idea that anything goes. It's very, very different from simple relativism. It is simply a kind of recognition of multiplicity. And that's sort of looking and kind of understanding and appreciating the constraints that we're working under is it's valuable as individuals, and it's certainly valuable as a community.
I think that speaks to what I was talking about too, about how delusion becomes that tension that we have to hold, that we are going to be a little bit delusional in a way, in that sense, right? It can become sort of generative, or a place to learn how to hold that tension and that recognition that you just spoke of, that we're constantly perpetuating actually the thing that we're studying, and therefore there's always going to be a little bit of delusion, but noticing it changes it. So I know we need to go. There's a million things I could talk to you about, but just to end, we didn't talk about you and your kind of track, but why do you care about this, Marek? Before we go, just to talk about care and love.
No, this I came to care about this. I guess my base degree, my undergraduate degree, is in psychology. And so I trained as a psychologist, for whatever that word means. But I would always have had a kind of a philosophical bent, a philosophical leaning, and my early postgraduate work was in philosophical psychology. And subsequently, I then sort of expanded into cognitive science, where I kind of did a master's in cognitive science, and then a DPhil or doctorate in the University of Sussex with the group there. So that would include the likes of Hannah Viar and Ezekiel De Paulo and Rob Klaus, and there was a whole host of kind of enactive people, where I was sort of introduced to enactive thinking. So while all that was happening, I was kind of paying my way by teaching on an undergraduate degree in a small college, in which I got handed a kind of final year critical issues in psychology module, which sort of fit my philosophical bent, and then also sort of blossomed into kind of one arm of my career, because as I sort of dug deeper into this stuff, it sort of became more difficult to teach certain things if I wasn't also able to leaven it with the kind of critical perspective that was included in those kind of more sort of conceptual and critical aspects of the development of psychology as kind of other areas of my teaching. And so those kind of two strands of my career, in terms of the research around philosophy and cognitive science and enactive thinking, and teaching, which included the conceptual and historical issues in the development of psychological science, they gradually coalesced over the past decade and a half or so to sort of culminate in there's kind of a number of individual papers, pretty much all of them with Craig, around scientific practice and psychology, and then the book is kind of just a one culmination of that, where all of these things kind of arrived together.
So you really care about psychology as a discipline too, then, I guess.
I really do. Like there's, for an awful lot of psychologists, I'm not a psychologist. I don't do enough empirical work for their tastes. I'm kind of dismissed as a philosopher. And it's nice to have philosophical, people doing philosophy, but it just isn't psychology and doesn't really fit. But I guess I disagree. I do consider myself a psychologist. I'm certainly paid by a department of psychology. And psychology is going through a period of change. These, as I said, these are discussions that have gone back decades, but there's a vigor, there's a passion to them at the moment, which is unusual in the history of the discipline. And I think there is certainly reason to take that seriously and to work seriously with it. And I think there's a sort of a possibility for transformation and ever increasingly successful psychological science on the back of it, if we can just sort of figure out a few of these, supposedly philosophical questions.
Well, you've been holding that tension in a way that we were talking about. So that's actually quite a service or something. I think this book, actually, both you and your co-author demonstrate it very well. So we need to go, and we'll just have to try and talk another time. But I just wanted to say thanks for doing that, for holding that tension. Thanks for the book. I'm excited about it. I'm really glad that we got to talk about it a little bit today.
Listen, thanks a million for inviting me in, and thanks a million for giving me some time. It's great to see you.
Good to see you too.